Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of Fellow Feeling. This will be Part 6, the second half to Chapter 5. Minutes later, Ryuku stands beside him, a few of her sidekicks perched atop her back. "Emergency services are inbound," she informs him, her voice slightly raspy in her dragon form. "We can't risk their lives by having them get too close to the tunnel entrances, so I'll have to fly your students to the perimeter we've established as soon as we find them." Another precious few minutes lost. Shouta has to stop himself from pacing, reminding himself how frustrated he'd been with Bakugo for doing the same thing. He has to stay calm. Ryuku is an excellent hero. If his students can be saved, she'll save them. "I'll lead you to them," Shouta says, waving a hand for Ryuku to follow him. But she just shakes her head. "No. Going into the tunnels ourselves is too risky. That villain will kill anyone he finds. We're going to have to dig them out from the surface." "You could crush them," Shouta protests. "How will you pinpoint their precise locations before you start digging?" Ryuku bares her teeth in what's probably supposed to be a reassuring smile, but what looks more like a leer when it's spread across the dragon's face. "Viper Eye will find them." On cue, one of the sidekicks slides from Ryuku's back, a hero dressed in a garish green uniform patterned with scales and snake eyes. She cracks her knuckles, asking Shouta, "Can you give me an approximate location?" He pauses, trying to calculate the distance. The tunnel curves left from where he's standing, and he definitely ran past the collapsed building plus an additional 5 or so minutes, and if that's the case... He leads Ryuku and Viper Eye past the collapsed building, moving until he thinks he's somewhere above where he left Midoriya and Bakugou. "Somewhere around here," he says. "Maybe a few dozen feet off, but I think..." Viper Eye draws back her fist, kneels, and smashes her knuckles into the ground in what looks like an incredibly painful strike. She doesn't flinch, though. Instead, she cocks her head as if listening for something. There's a moment of silence. Then the sidekick rises, moves quickly down the street, and issues the ground another ringing strike that leaves her knuckles scraped and bloody. Then again, and again. "I can see something," she murmurs after the 6th strike. "I think 2 people. They're kids, right?" "Students," Shouta confirms, relief searing through him. Viper Eye hums. "Okay, I think I've got them. Let me make sure I have a precise location, then we can dig for them." She draws back her fist just one last time, gives just one last blow, and then stops. Her breath shortens. "Ryuku, the villain." Ryuku's eyes narrow to slits. "Cinder, get them out, now!" Another sidekick hits the ground, boot landing exactly where Viper Eye is pointing. The cement explodes. Shouta recoils as the sidewalk blossoms up like a rose, petals of cement cracking out from the central point that Ryuku's sidekick had identified. The spiraling pillar of cement rips, almost tearing along the sidewalk, creating a yawning mouth through which Shouta can just barely see the cold, greenish tint of the maintenance tunnels. And in that tunnel, the hulking form of the villain twists around, leering viciously at the heroes that have just uncovered him. Ryuku is yelling immediately, giving orders to her sidekicks, preparing for a fight. But Shouta doesn't hear any of it, doesn't see the frantic actions of his fellow heroes as they get ready for battle. All he can see is the villain's teeth, red and dripping with blood. "Cinder, get the villain away from the kids," Ryuku calls, her voice booming and almost painful to Shouta's ears. The sidekick moves forward with a lurch, stomping the ground, and the stone that comprises the tunnels blooms again, stretching upwards in a flurry of petals and leaves, closing around the villain with a snap and flinging him out of the tunnel. The villain hits the ground, the sidewalk shattering beneath his hulking form. When he looks up, Shouta realizes that it's not just his teeth that have been painted red. It's his entire muzzle, his hands, and his claws. His claws. A hand closes around his arm, and he blinks and realizes that one of Ryuku's sidekicks is trying to pull him away from the fight that's about to ensue. "Stay back!" Ryuku roars, her wings flaring wide as she leaps, placing herself in between the villain and the tunnels he's just been extracted from. Her jaw snaps viciously as the villain gets to his feet, visibly weakened after his last encounter with the great dragon. "The rest of you take cover! I will not let him get past me!" The hand on Shouta's arm tightens, and as the wind from Ryuku's flapping wings begins to intensify, he doesn't have a choice. He dives behind the nearest cover, shoes scrabbling in the rubble as he rolls to safety, and Ryuku's roar shakes the entire block as she attacks. Daring to glance out at the street, Shouta sees Ryuku rearing up on her hind legs, smashing the villain down with one mighty blow. He winces as the villain's claws drag along her hide, trying to poison her, but her scales are too thick for even those razor-sharp talons to slice through. She really is the best match for the villain, Shouta realizes, watching the way she snaps her jaws around the villain's leg and bites until he screams. If she can just keep the villain at a distance, he can extract his students and get them to safety. Except, then a particularly vicious chunk of stone is flung his way, stirred up by the wind, and he has to duck behind cover to avoid being killed. He isn't going to be able to make it back to the tunnel while the fight is still going on. He'll have to... Cement blossoms around him, a shell that hides him from the battle. When he looks up, he sees two of Ryuku's sidekicks watching him with sharp, determined eyes. One of them, Cinder, he thinks, shoots him a thumbs up and gestures in the direction of the tunnels. It's the only invitation he needs to run, using the cement petals as cover until he spots the newly forged entrance to the tunnels and dives for it, sliding the final few feet and dropping straight down. He's not sure what he'd expected, but being hit point-blank by an explosion definitely hadn't been at the top of his list. The last time he'd seen Bakugo, he'd been too freezing to produce even a drop of sweat after all. But now... Die! 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 Shouta hits the wall with a crack, recognizing the distinct feeling of several of his ribs snapping like toothpicks. Gasping, he barely catches himself before he falls over, vaguely registering that Bakugo is alive and attacking him, that he needs to erase his quirk if he wants to avoid serious injury. But there's dust in his eyes, stirred up by Ryuku's wings, and he has to blink so frequently that he can't maintain his quirk for more than a second. His visibility is impaired. He can't even see Bakugo, just hear his voice and his thunderous explosions. Outside, Ryuku roars in pain. The world shakes. "Eraserhead!" calls one of the sidekicks from the surface. Another explosion rings out, this time aimed at one of the sidekicks, and there's a high scream as rubble flies through the air. "Get back!" calls a frantic, terrified voice, one that he recognizes as Bakugo's. The blood on the villain's claws flickers through his mind, and Shouta realizes that this time, Bakugo must have gotten a heavy dose of the fear-inducing venom. Have to erase his quirk. Shouta shoots forward, struggling to see through the dust and lingering smoke. If he can find Bakugo even for a moment, he can erase his quirk before he has the chance to use his explosions again. There's no risk of him collapsing a building on top of himself, not this time. But he could very easily kill any of Ryuku's sidekicks or himself. Or Midoriya. Shouta can see no sign of him through the haze, no flicker of green, but he has to be here somewhere. Outside, the wind whips, Ryuku's wings stirring the air in a new direction. And for the split second that the smoke and dust is disturbed, Shouta sees it, a flash of ash blonde and bloody orange, shining just briefly through the smoke. A desperate cry rings out, a fist flying in Shota's direction, and he erases his student's quirk just in time to avoid having his head blown off his shoulders. He has to blink immediately after, eyes watering even as the dust grows thinner, but Bakugo manages to get out a shrimpy explosion before his quirk is stolen away from him again. "Bakugo!" he yells over the noise, but there's no recognition behind his eyes. Shouta can see red dripping down his arms and over his hands, blood washing from some unseen wound, and he knows that his suspicions are correct. There's venom flowing through Bakugo's veins. Shouta dares to take a step forward. Midoriya hadn't recognized him while under the worst of the venom's effects, but maybe Bakugo will be able to. "I said stay back!" Another punch, but no explosion follows, and Bakugo looks shocked, he thinks, and frightened at the prospect that his quirk isn't obeying him. He lashes out again, his fist stirring the veil of dust that surrounds him, but he can't produce so much as a spark while Shota's eyes are on him. "One of you, restrain him!" Shouta yells to the sidekicks, never taking his eyes off of Bakugo. But he has to blink. It's inevitable with all the dust floating around him. And the instant he does, the air fills with fire and ash and flying chips of stone. A sharp cry rings out, Cinder slamming her hands to the ground as a massive ball of cement petals blossoms up around Bakugo in an attempt to keep him contained. But the petals are delicate, and Shouta can't see Bakugo through them, so all it takes is one sharp explosion to scatter them. One of the splinters of concrete leaves a nasty gash above Shota's left eye as it flies. He feels the skin split, feels the blood begin to drip down over his eyelid, and he swears. The last thing he needs is another obstacle to using his quirk. But he has it far better than the two sidekicks that had followed him here, as both of them are knocked in the gut and bowled clean over by the debris from Bakugo's explosion. Not for the first time. Shouta curses the fact that his capture weapon is wrapped around Midoriya's stomach instead of in his hands. If he had it, this would be over. Bakugo makes this choking, furious sound, another explosion ringing in the air, but this one doesn't seem to be aimed at anyone in particular. Get away! Don't come any closer! Shouta drops as a bit of concrete whisks past his head. Bakugo's fear is so intense that he can't seem to make sense of his surroundings. He has to get a student to recognize him. Bakugo! He tries again, daring to take a single step closer. You need to calm down. The villain... Bakugo screams, throwing out both hands in an attempt to blast him to bits, but Shouta erases his quirk just in time. He's acting just like Midoriya had upon being slashed by the villain's claws, shaking terribly, eyes glassy, a cold sweat dripping from his brow that must explain the magnitude of his explosions. Whatever he's seeing right now, it's not Shouta. I'll kill you, Bakugo warns frantically as Shouta takes another step forward, lowering himself closer to the ground like a wild animal. And even though he's terrified, visibly trembling with the strain of the situation, he doesn't run. In fact, he doesn't seem willing to move even an inch from where he's standing. Is he so afraid that he's frozen in place? Another massive gust of wind strikes him from behind, the result of Ryuku's mighty wings, and the dust in the tunnel clears even further. And Shouta sees Midoriya. He's leaned up against what remains of the tunnel wall, colorless and completely still, hidden partially behind his classmate. Shouta can't get a better look at him, not at this distance and through what remains of the dust, but the stillness terrifies him. He has to get to Midoriya, and he has to get there now. If he's still alive, he won't be for much longer. No, stop! Bakugo flings a bloody arm to the side, covering Midoriya, as Shouta tries to get closer, tries to get him to safety, and while Shouta still can't pinpoint the source of the blood, it can't be anything good. You can't hurt him! I won't let you! I'm not going to hurt him. I'm going to help you both. Bakugo pauses, shuffling back to shield Midoriya more completely. He blinks, slow and sluggish, like he's trying to puzzle through his teacher's words. Bakugo, you have to listen to me, he says, taking slow, measured steps in his direction. I know you're scared, but Midoriya's going to die if you don't let me help you. Do you want him to die? Another blink, uncertain. Bakugo curls his lip as Shouta takes just one step too close, shoving himself back until he's crowding his classmate against the wall. Still, Midoriya doesn't move. I saved him, is what he says, frantic and almost delirious. I protected him. He's safe. He's dying. No, he's not. Not again. I'm not letting him. Behind them, a desperate roar rings out, the earth shaking violently. Ryuku's fight seems to be drifting closer, and Shouta is not going to let his students get caught in the crossfire. Not again. Bakugo's reaction to the roar is practically animalistic. He scrambles away from Shouta, his back pressed to Midoriya's chest, arms slung out at either side, like he intends to take whatever blow he thinks is being aimed at his classmate. And that is when Shouta gets a good look at his injuries. He looks like he's been in a fight with a hurricane. Claw marks are slashed down his arms and over his chest, clustered and crisscrossed as if the villain had struck him many times in rapid succession. His costume is black, so it hides the worst of the blood, but the red dripping down his arms is thick and plentiful. One of his eyes is completely puffed closed, a claw mark torn viciously atop it, and his uneven breath stirs the blood-crusted wisps of hair that hang over his sooty forehead. He'd shielded Midoriya. When the villain had found them in those tunnels, he'd thrown himself in front of his injured classmate, probably knowing that any more blood loss would spell certain death. Shouta's heart clenches with some bitter combination of admiration and horror that a student had gone to such lengths in an attempt to preserve Midoriya's life. Now it's up to him to make sure that Bakugo's efforts haven't been in vain. Okay, Shouta says, deciding to try a different strategy. You protected him. You did well, Bakugo, but now other people need your help. His student narrows his eyes suspiciously. There are more lives in danger, Shouta presses, knowing that this is his best chance of convincing Bakugo to hand Midoriya over to him. You're a strong hero. You can save them. Bakugo cocks his head, gears turning slowly behind his eyes, like he wants to listen, but the amount of sheer panic flooding through his body is holding his coherency at bay. All you have to do is take a few steps towards me, Shouta coaxes, glancing quickly to the mouth of the tunnel where he sees Ryuku's sidekicks finally getting back to their feet. If he can just lure Bakugo away from Midoriya, the sidekicks can drag him out of the tunnel without further risk to anyone's lives. But first, Bakugo has to listen to him. Just a few steps, okay? You can trust me, I promise. I'm not going to do anything to hurt you or Midoriya. But Bakugo shrinks back, and Shouta feels himself losing ground. He said that too, is the vicious response, one of his arms curling back to hide Midoriya from sight. But he lied. Are you lying? Another rumble from behind them. The clock is ticking down. I'm not like him, Shouta says, struggling to keep the anguish out of his voice. You said it yourself, remember. I won't let anything happen to either of you. Bakugo releases a shaking breath, squeezing his eyes shut as if he's attempting to reconcile what he's seeing with what he's feeling. He's fighting his fear, Shouta realizes. Somewhere deep down he knows that this is the result of a quirk. He just needs one more push. You're trying to become a hero so you can be the best, right? He asks, watching the way Bakugo's chest hitches. So you can save people. Well, you're never going to reach your goal unless you can learn to fight the fear you're feeling right now. Bakugo shakes his head. Or, he stops, tripping over his next words because he doesn't want to play into Bakugo's insecurities, but he needs to get to Midoriya. Or is it that you're not strong enough to fight it? Bakugo's body locks tight, his eyes dilate, and though it's subtle, Shouta can pinpoint the exact moment that he goes from terrified to terrified and determined. Bakugo takes a deep breath, and while it's still shaky, his expression has shifted from furious to uncertain. Just a few steps? He asks, slow and slurred like he's speaking through a mouthful of molasses. Just a few steps? He asks, slow and slurred like he's speaking through a mouthful of molasses. Just a few, Shouta confirms, relief flooding through him. You don't even have to come to me. You just have to walk this way. And I can save people. I promise you can. Bakugo watches him for a long moment, considering, until finally, he inches just a bit closer to Shouta. Good, Shouta encourages, shooting the sidekicks another meaningful glance. Just a few more steps. Another step. Then, tensing, Bakugo looks back at where Midoriya slumped behind him, as if second-guessing his actions. Quickly, Shouta assures. He's okay. You already saved him. Now you have to worry about the people that are still in danger. Namely yourself. Another uncertain glance. I'm not sure if... Eraserhead! Shouta jolts, startled by the cry, and looks up just in time to see the hulking shadow fly over his head, crashing violently into the splintered sidewalk directly to his right. The villain rolls, claws digging furrows in the cement, his thick, powerful tail whipping in the air, in counterbalance to the flailing of his arms. By the time the villain comes to a halt, he's mere feet from where Shouta is standing. Ryuku soars overhead, folding her wings as if to strike the villain like a battering ram and carry him as far away from the tunnels as possible. She brings her back legs round, talons extended in preparation to scoop the villain up. But that's not what happens. What happens is that the villain looks up, sees the hero descending upon him, sees Shouta standing to his side, and aptly decides that his only way out of the situation is to take a hostage. Shouta chokes in shock as one of the villain's massive hands curls around his good arm, whipping him around and slamming him unforgivingly into the crumbling concrete. The breath is knocked out of him by the blow, leaving him coughing and gasping for air, but he's been in this situation often enough to know how to stay calm. He pulls, trying to free himself, but the villain's grasp is absolute. Ryuku's wings flare as she stops her attack, stalling in midair. Her eyes turn to slits, taking in the situation, and she lands heavily across from the villain. Coward! She snarls, her teeth clicking as she speaks. The villain just steps back, dragging Shouta with him. His claws scrape along his arm, leaving shallow furrows in their wake, and the effect is almost immediate. He's probably already unloaded the majority of his venom into Midoriya and Bakugou, so it's a testament to his immense power that Shouta shudders, his heart jumping in his chest, his body going fuzzy and warm and wired, like he's chugged a gallon of espresso while standing atop a tightrope thousands of feet in the sky. He feels like he's standing dizzyingly far off the ground, suspended above a pit, and the pit contains a collection of every bad thing that has ever happened to him. But no. He knows what this is. He knows this quirk. He can control it. There's not enough venom in his system to override his rational mind, though suddenly he understands why both Midoriya and Bakugou attacked him. On a strong dose, it must be impossible to differentiate between reality and fiction. The villain takes another step back, whipping Shouta to one side, and he hisses as his bat arm grinds along the jagged concrete. He lands twisted on his side, his spine protesting the motion, but it gives him a perfect view of the tunnels, where students still await rescue. Midoriya hasn't moved a muscle, which isn't surprising. But Bakugo is staring. His eyes track the villain's arm, dragging up, until he reaches his massive crocodilian head. His eyes widen at the sight of his dripping teeth, his sharp eyes, his leering smile. His palm pops once, briefly, and the villain hears him. The villain turns, his snout swinging to face where Bakugo is standing, covering Midoriya's body with his own. His yellow, slitted eyes grow even more narrower as he registers the sight, and his leer deepens, turns into something more resembling a smirk. "Another hostage," he rumbles, slow and stupid, dropping down on all fours. His student tenses, fingers curling into a tight fist, but he doesn't move. "Run," Shouta wants to tell him, even as Bakugo digs in his heels and snarls. "Get far away from here." But of course he won't. Midoriya still sprawled behind him, unconscious and helpless, and Bakugo's fear-addled mind has already decided that he'd rather die than let him go. "Bakugo!" Shouta forces out, still struggling to regain his breath. "Don't!" His student looks at him once, briefly, as if considering his command, but then the villain moves forward, takes one singular step, carrying him exactly one step too close to Midoriya. And just like that, it's over. Bakugo's pupils constrict so sharply that Shouta can see it, red swallowing black until mere pinpricks remain, and his fingers uncurl in a blink. He moves forward, matching the villain's step with one of his own, and throws his arm out with a yell so loud that it rivals even Ryuku's loudest roar. Shouta doesn't erase his quirk this time. "Die!" The explosion that tears out of Bakugo's palm is so bright, so loud, so vicious, that Shouta is instantly deafened. The world flashes with white, then yellow, then orange as the flames burst forth, rivaling even Endeavor's in their intensity as they spew from the edges of the mighty explosion. The light, airy sound of shattering glass joins with the sound of falling concrete and shrieking steel, the windows along the entire block blowing out with the force of the shock wave that ripples outwards. Shouta had thought that Bakugo could never top the firepower from one of his fully loaded gauntlets, not with his bare hands. But now, skin seared from the heat of the explosion, ears ringing, the entire city around him decimated, he realizes how wrong he'd been. All he'd needed was the right motivation. Shouta barely registers it when the villain's claws unhook from his skin. The hulking beast toppled by the sheer intensity of the explosion that had just hit him square in the head. The world is fuzzy in the wake of the shockwave, tilting on axis when he forces his sluggish body to roll onto one side. The low-grade panic that the villain's venom had induced is still buzzing beneath his skin, adding a layer of awfulness to the situation, but it's not so powerful that he can't breathe through it as he maneuvers himself onto his stomach, fighting to get his arms and legs beneath him. "I've got you!" The voice is muted, thick with dust and smoke, and Shouta huffs as a massive taloned paw scoops beneath his body, lifting him out of danger. He's deposited safely against the remains of what feels like a wall, getting one good look at Ryuku's back as she leaps to where the villain is wailing, scrabbling in the rubble and pawing at his head as if he can knock the ringing out of his ears, the fire out of his eyes. He clearly hadn't expected Bakugo's attack to be so vicious, and he hadn't bothered to guard his head. The villain pitches onto his front, shaking his head repeatedly, but he never has the chance to get back up. Ryuku's leap carries her straight to where he lies, one of her massive paws landing in the center of the villain's back, with brutalizing force, crushing the breath out of him. Her jaw snaps down as she bites, fangs sinking into the scaly flesh of the beast's shoulder, drawing blood in a scream. Then she lifts the villain in her jaws and, in one smooth motion, smashes his body into the jagged concrete. He stops screaming. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 5 of Fellow Feeling. Chapter 6 will be up next. Eager to hear your thoughts and reactions to this chapter, and as always, thank you so much for listening.